is a sentence that tends to end more conversations than almost any other sentence in the English language. And it isn't technically wrong, which is exactly why it works so well. Someone says something that you might disagree with, and if you push back, they say, well, that's just my opinion. And this basically stops the conversation because you can't necessarily argue that that is their opinion. And not because the disagreement has been resolved, but because the sentence has done something very clever. It has reframed a claim about the world as a fact about the speaker. And the facts about the speaker apparently are not up for debate. You can argue with what someone thinks is true, but you cannot argue with what someone happens to feel. And so the move is from this is true to this is just my opinion. And it's a fortification that is really hard to get through. And I think it's worth asking, with real seriousness, whether this fortification is one that we should just be granting as freely as we do. Because the strange thing about how we actually live is underneath the sentence. We don't necessarily treat all opinions equally, and we never have. We trust some opinions enough to build hospitals around them, airplanes around them, and entire bodies of law around them. But we also dismiss some opinions as nonsense the moment that they get spoken. We have, in practice, an elaborate and mostly unspoken hierarchy of whose opinions deserve weight and why. And yet, the moment the conversation turns to politics or ethics, or anything that feels personal rather than technical, that hierarchy essentially collapses, and we revert to treating every opinion as a sovereign notion, untouchable, entitled to the same respect, regardless of what's actually true. And that inconsistency is the real subject of today. Because while opinions do matter, we cannot navigate a single day without forming judgments about things that we can't fully verify. But perhaps it's time to start questioning what the word opinion is actually protecting. I think part of the confusion here comes from the fact that we use one word to cover several genuinely different things, and the differences matter more than the conversation usually allows. A preference is simply what somebody likes. Chocolate over vanilla, mornings over evenings, and preferences are immune to argument almost by definition, because there's essentially no fact underneath them to be right or wrong about. A belief is something a person takes to be true, regardless of whether they can defend it. An opinion, though, sits in an uncomfortable middle zone, a judgment about something often dressed in the language of fact, that may or may not be backed by anything resembling evidence or even reasoning. And knowledge is the rare case where a belief has actually been tested, justified, and has survived the kind of scrutiny that would have destroyed it if it were false. The problem is that that's just my opinion gets deployed as if every claim in that list deserves the same shield that protects the first one. Nobody owes you an argument for why you prefer mornings. But if your claim moves from I like this to this is true or right, then you have stepped outside of the territory that preference protects and into a different territory that has to answer to something other than your own feelings. Socrates understood this distinction better than almost anyone who came after him, and it's worth remembering what actually made him dangerous enough that a city voted to execute him for it. He was not dangerous because he had radical opinions. He was dangerous because he kept asking people to defend the opinions that they already had. And an uncomfortable number of his fellow Athenians discovered that under pressure, they didn't actually know what they thought they knew. His famous claim to wisdom is that he knew the limits of what he knew, while the people around him mistook his confidence for understanding. The gap between feeling certain and being justified is the entire subject of this video, and it has not gotten any smaller in 2,400 years. When "that's just my opinion" gets used as a conversation ender rather than an honest description, it's worth asking what it's actually shielding. Sometimes it's shielding a person's right to hold a view without being harassed for it, which is legitimate and worth defending. But increasingly often, it's shielding something less noble: the view itself from the one thing that could expose whether it deserves to survive, which is scrutiny. John Stuart Mill built an entire philosophy of free expression around the idea that ideas need to be tested against opposition to mean anything at all. So this means that not every opinion should get treated equally. In fact, he argued the exact opposite. We can only have confidence that an opinion is true if it has actually been forced to fight for that status openly and against the strongest objections available, rather than being protected from the fight altogether. An opinion that has never been seriously challenged is not a strong opinion. It's simply an opinion that's never been tested, which means that nobody, including the person that holds it, actually knows whether it would survive the test. And this is where the modern version of my opinion starts to look less like an act of humility and more like avoidance. Treating a claim as immune to challenge is not intellectual modesty. Mill's entire point was that the people most confident in their beliefs should be the most eager to have them challenged, because either the belief survives and comes out stronger, or it doesn't survive and you've learned something true that you didn't know before. Shielding an opinion from that process does not protect the opinion. It just protects ignorance of whether the opinion was ever good. But I feel that in modern society, this idea of equality has essentially made it impossible, or at least very hard, to argue against people for their opinions. But treating people as equals does not require treating their claims as equally valid. Those are two very different commitments, and conflating them is one of the more quietly damaging habits of contemporary thinking. Of course, every person deserves to be heard with basic respect, regardless of education status or background. That's just a claim about moral worth, and I'm not interested in arguing against that. But whether a particular claim about vaccines or economics or history or ethics is actually correct has nothing to do with the moral worth of the person making it. A claim's truth depends on whether it's been informed by evidence and survives logical scrutiny, not on how sincerely or passionately it was offered, and not on the dignity of the person who is offering it, which remains intact either way. Some opinions are built on actual study of a subject, and some are built on a 5-minute scroll through whatever confirms what that person already wanted to believe. And some are responsive to evidence and willing to update when new evidence arrives. Some are immune to evidence by design and constructed specifically so that nothing could ever count against them. And some opinions are functioning less as claims about the world and merely more performances of identity, ways of signaling which group we belong to and which group we have preferences for. But none of that variation disappears just because we have agreed, as a matter of being polite, to call all of it an opinion and leave it at that. That word is doing a lot of work to flatten differences that are, underneath the surface, enormous. But what made the Socratic method so effective and so threatening to the people who eventually had him killed for it was a discipline that is repeatable and learnable for finding out whether a belief could survive being questioned. Ask someone what justice is, and Socrates would not necessarily tell them that they were wrong any way they answered. He would simply just keep asking what they meant, and what followed from what they had said, whether their own definition produced consequences that they would actually accept. And again, people who walked into the conversation certain of what they believed walked out having discovered that their certainty had never been built on anything that could hold weight. And this gives us a test that still works today. The test is simply, can the claim be defended under real pressure? Genuinely trying to find its weak points without the person holding it retreating into, well, that's just how I feel. An opinion that can survive that pressure has actually earned something. An opinion that can only survive by refusing to enter the room has not earned anything at all and should not be protected. And in reality, you cannot have a functioning society if opinions are all treated equally. Because treating every claim as equally valid just because every person deserves equal respect is doing real damage in places that matter. In politics, it produces a public square where expertise and uninformed conviction are treated as equally legitimate inputs, which means the people who have spent decades studying a problem and the people who watched one video about it are granted the same authority, and the conversation degrades to whichever voice is loudest, rather than whichever voice has actually done the work. If we actually accept that all opinions are equally valid, truth stops being a meaningful category at all. It just becomes one more flavor of preference, which is no more binding than a choice between two colors or two desserts. And if we go the other direction and treat every disagreement as a threat to be defended against, rather than a claim to be examined, then discussion itself becomes impossible, because nobody can afford to be wrong in public anymore. And there is a real tension sitting underneath everything that I've talked about today. We need opinions. Nobody necessarily has the luxury of waiting for certainty before acting. Most of life happens under exactly the kind of uncertainty that forces us to form judgments on incomplete information. And a person who refused to hold any opinion until it met the standard of proven knowledge would never get out of bed in the morning. But needing opinions and needing standards for evaluating them are not in conflict with one another. The goal was never to stop having opinions. Modern people don't actually suffer from having too many of them. They actually suffer from having too many that have never once been asked to defend themselves. The goal is to make the opinions that we do hold answerable to something outside of our own certainty about them, to reality, to evidence, and to the pressure of a genuinely hostile question, so that the ones that survive has actually earned the confidence that we are putting into them, and the ones that don't survive can be let go without costing anyone anything except an illusion that we didn't need in the first place. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see y'all next time.